Hello, middies. This week is going to be your May 4th through May 8th lessons. This past week, or last week, I had you guys kind of work on some of the Cold War things that kind of led up to the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And overall, you guys did a pretty solid job with that. This lecture is going to be continuing off of that, kind of hit some of the points that I thought some of you guys maybe struggled with, had some questions on. And then we will kind of move forward with some, I guess, newer things for this week that we're going to be focusing on. So I believe last week we ended off with the U-2 incident. The thing that really is going to spark in the 60s, the Cuban Missile Crisis and so forth. We've been spending a lot of time talking about spying. And obviously the U-2 spy plane are things that we were doing in the Soviet Union and probably all over Europe and all over Asia, spying on our enemies, hence the Soviet Union, just like they were doing with Alger Hiss and the Rosenbergs and sending spies in the Manhattan Project. So both sides were doing it, but this U-2 spy plane, Francis Gary Powers, shot down over the Soviet Union. He was captured, held as prisoner in the Soviet Union for quite a long time. So that's going to spark, to kind of go a step further, as you guys read in your guys' web quest. In the late 1950s, there was a Cuban Revolution that happened, where you had a communist group led by Fidel Castro. Vocabulary term you know who that is. Fidel Castro is a communist that is going to change the landscape in Cuba. He's going to take away the capitalistic nature. And now, why did it matter to the United States? Well, the U.S. had businesses in Cuba. We had an economic status in Cuba. So what Fidel Castro did is that he went into Cuba and basically overthrew and got rid of the rich landowners, those that were friendly towards the United States, and kind of took upon their resources toward about Cuba, not worrying about other countries like the United States. So that was a big threat to the United States when Fidel Castro came into power and spread communism now 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Now again, containment. Now it's spreading right into our hemisphere now. So very dangerous. So when that began to happen, the CIA began planning, well, how can we get rid of Castro? This obviously this guy is dangerous. This guy is spreading communism. We have a lot of business interest in Cuba. We need to get rid of him. So they started planning this Bay of Pigs invasion. And ultimately what it was that when Fidel Castro got rid of a bunch of these Cubans had to leave Cuba, and a lot of them came to the United States. They settled in Miami or in Florida. And what the CIA did is that they trained a handful of these Cuban exiles that did not like Castro, trained them in military tactics, armed them with weapons and training. And the plan was that for these Cuban rebels to go back to Cuba and to overthrow Fidel Castro, to kill him, and to retake the government. Now, the CIA's thinking is that if the Cuban people saw these rebels come back, that they would join them. They would join these exiles, join these Cuban rebels, and it would start this big revolution all over again. Boy, were they wrong. They were mistaken. When they landed, it didn't go according to plan, and it'll end up being a big disaster. Now, kind of going through these bullet points here, there was increasing friction between the United States and Castro's communist regime that led President Eisenhower to basically break off all economic ties with Cuba in 1961. Even before that, the CIA had been training anti-revolutionary Cuban exiles for a possible invasion of Cuba, hence because communism is there. So the invasion plan was approved by Eisenhower's the next president, was JFK. However, most of the planning that was done by Eisenhower and the CIA. When JFK became president, he kind of inherited that plan, and the CIA convinced JFK and his advisors that this plan was going to work. So JFK signed off on it with the advice of Dwight Eisenhower and the CIA, even though he had some hesitations. Daddy. So hold on, Chasey. On April 17th, 1961, about 1,300 of these exiles who we trained are going to be armed with U.S. weapons. And they're going to land at something known as the Bay of Pigs in the southern part of Cuba. And they're going to, again, as I said, hope for support of the locals. So from the start, the exiles were likely to lose this because Kennedy had the option, JFK had the option of using the Air Force against the Cubans, but decided not to because he wanted to try and have as less U.S. involvement as possible by equipping and training these Cuban exiles. We're not using U.S. military. That was a part of it. Try to keep this as very covert and very as secret, as less U.S. involvement as possible. So consequently, because JFK was hesitant on using the Air Force and other weapons to help out these exiles, the invasion was stopped by Castro's army. It basically had no chance. These exiles had no chance. The failure of the invasion seriously is going to embarrass Kennedy. Although, again, most of the planning was done under Eisenhower, but now JFK is the president. He's the boss. So this will be a huge black eye to the start of his presidency, knowing that this plan did not work under his watch. So some critics are going to blame Kennedy for not giving it the adequate support of the Air Force and military that it was going to need. Others blame Kennedy for allowing it to even happen to begin with. So from that point on, think about Castro. America and JFK, in Castro's eyes, is now going to be the enemy. So who was he going to turn to for support? The Soviet Union and Khrushchev. So obviously you have a big, powerful country like the United States who's trying to assassinate you. You're going to now reach out to Khrushchev and the Soviet Union for some help. So that would be the Bay of Pigs. So we'll talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis here in a minute, but the Berlin Wall. So finally in the 1960s, kind of give you guys some context behind this. I know we talked about this a couple weeks ago about the Berlin airlift. That was different. This is going to be something new. So guys, in the 1940s and 1950s, you have millions. I'll say it again. Millions. Is that good, Chase? My man. We have millions of East Berliners. Remember, you had West Berlin, which was American, British, and French, and you had East Berlin, which was Soviet. So you had a lot of East Berliners, millions of them, that were fleeing and going to West Berlin. They were leaving. So think about how would that make the Soviet Union look, that the people who you're controlling doesn't want you there. They're going to the American zone. That's embarrassing. Big time, making you look weak. So finally, in 1961, Khrushchev and the Soviet Union had enough. Basically overnight, they will start to construct the Berlin Wall. It would be barbed wire at first, a barbed wire area that will eventually be filled in with concrete and bricks and actual wall structure that will arrive to actually split up East and West Berlin. So no longer are you able to leave now. You're stuck. You're trapped. You're basically, think of it like you're a fish in a glass bowl. You can't leave. So within days, workers cemented concrete blocks into this low wall and dividing neighborhoods and families, workers and employees. So think about that. You may have worked in that zone. You may have had family in West Berlin and friends and coworkers, etc. Now overnight, that wall's there and you will never see them again. There are families who are literally going to be split up. Workers split up. Not having a job, period. So the Berlin Wall was constructed in 1961. It won't come down until 1889. So think about that, guys. For 28 years, the Berlin Wall will be constructed where you're going to be separated from people who you might love. So the Soviet Union is going to call the barrier to Western imperialism. It was also meant to prevent people from going to the West, as I said. The Western Berlin was the standard of living in West Berlin was much higher, much more freedoms. That's why East Berliners were leaving. So what happens if you try to escape? Towers full of guardsmen will be on top of the towers, and if you tried to escape and go into West Berlin, you were shot in the spot. That's what they were trained to do. There were forbidden zones. There were walls. Again, no one was allowed to enter. Again, you were shot on sight.
What?
Okay, I'll take care of it. Daddy's doing a video, okay? So, zip it. Alright, so now going to the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is kind of what I had you guys do a section of your web quest on. So this was the 13 days in October of 1962 that will be the closest that the United States will come to nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. The U.S. Armed Forces were the highest state of readiness, so they called it DEFCON. They were DEFCON 1, 2, and 3. DEFCON 1 meant you were basically at nuclear war. You were actually firing missiles. DEFCON 2 means that you were doing training. You were making sure that your missiles were working, and DEFCON 3 was just alertness. So for the first time in history, we were at DEFCON 2. we were actually doing training missions, getting ready for military exercises to go to war. Again, that's never been done before. Let's see here. So 1962, the USSR lagged far behind the United States in the arms race. Soviet missiles were only powerful enough to be launched against Europe, but U.S. missiles were capable of striking the entire Soviet Union. So at this point, 1962, we had missiles in Europe that were pointing at the Soviet Union. They were located, I believe, in Turkey. But the Soviet Union didn't have the capability of hitting the United States from where they were at. They were much longer distance. So for them, the Soviet Union, it was to their best interest to find an ally who's close to the United States that they could place their missiles in to basically do the same thing that we were doing to them. So in April of 1962, Premier Khrushchev deployed missiles to Cuba to provide a deterrent to a potential U.S. attack against the USSR. Castro was looking for a way to defend his lands. We saw Khrushchev and the Soviet Union as a way to defend, because remember the Bay of Pigs. Castro felt threatened. So ever since the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, Castro felt the second attack was inevitable. Consequently, he approved of Khrushchev's plan to place missiles in Cuba. And in 1962, Khrushchev and the Soviet Union began secretly installing these missiles in Cuba. So the crisis was going to begin in October 15th, 1962, when U.S. spy planes over Cuba caught Soviet missiles construction in Cuba. We took these pictures, and they went back to JFK. After 7 days of intense debate within the White House, John F. K. had a few choices. Either option one, you invade Cuba. The problem is if you invade Cuba, what's that going to do? It's going to cause World War III. The Soviets are going to defend themselves. You can do airstrikes and airstrike these missile sites. Again, if you airstrike, they can be caught as an act of war, causing World War III, nuclear war. Or you can do option three, which would be to do a blockade. So that's what JFK is going to choose to do, is do a blockade of Cuba. Nothing in, nothing out. Stopping all Soviet things from going in and out of the country. And we're going to demand that the Soviets remove all weapons from Cuba. And at first, the Soviets play dumb. We don't know what you're talking about. There's no missiles there. This is crazy United States. But eventually, we'll show them. We'll prove them at the UN meeting. We'll get to later on. So tensions finally began to ease on October 28th. When Khrushchev announced that he would dismantle the installations and remove the missiles, expressing the trust that the U.S. would not invade Cuba. Now, there's a secret deal done, guys. Basically, to make a long story short, the Soviets, they were embarrassed. We handed over the evidence at the UN meeting, made the Soviets look very bad after all those months of lying, saying they didn't know what we were talking about. So Kennedy had the upper hand. He basically said, hey, you will publicly get rid of these missiles, but privately, we're going to get rid of our missiles in Turkey. Now, that was done on the private end, us doing that. But they had to do theirs publicly. So the slow thaw. So the end of World War II, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan. So these are all the presidents that were involved in the Cold War. Here, President Truman, President Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. We'll talk about them more sporadically. But as you guys see in this slide here, the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s was consumed by the Cold War. Think about how many movies and TV shows that were created during this time. You have, Indiana Jones. There was a Temple of the Crystal Skull was set to pay the Soviets as the villains. You had Rocky Balboa, the boxing movie of the 70s. You have Miracle on Ice of the 80s, the U.S.-Soviet hockey teams. You had cartoons, and you had political cartoons. You had a bunch of things that were created to basically make the Soviet Union look bad in these Hollywood films. However, as you'll see in the 70s, the relations got better. As you guys see in the slide here, President Nixon, who was president of the United States in the early part of the 70s, late 60s, and early 70s, he's going to make the first trip to China to try and smooth over relations with the Chinese, again, who were communist, because that was best for our economy. We have good relations with them. All right, so we'll talk more about this later on. So what we're going to do, and then your assignment for this week is going to be going over the Vietnam War. There'll be an assignment you'll need to complete to give you a little intro on that. Let me know if you have any questions. Hope you guys are doing well. Talk to you soon.